has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. An hour ago, the Premier of New South Wales confirmed it is the position of his government that negative gearing reform should be considered. Given that the Premier at the state at the heart of Australia's housing affordability crisis has put negative gearing reform on the table, why does the Prime Minister continue to rule it out? And is getting rich parents still his only policy on housing affordability?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I think I'll check exactly what the Premier said before I take the Leader of the Opposition's word on it. He has a bit of a track record for misrepresentation.
The Prime Minister, the Leader of the House, the Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
I'd just like to table the transcript. It was a question from the Financial Review. Do you and your government think negative gearing is a problem? I think I have an answer to that. My answer is yes. It should be considered. Here it is, black and white.
Is leave granted? Leave's not granted. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we know that the Leader of the Opposition has form in misrepresentation, misrepresentation and distortion. But he's free to wave around whatever he likes. But the one thing he's not very good at is sticking to the facts. But, Mr. Speaker, let me. Mr. Speaker, normally the glass jaw takes a bit longer to appear than this. I mean, really. But look, seriously, Mr. Speaker, I think we'd all be sensitive to charges of misrepresentation if we were so assiduous at it as the Leader of the Opposition. One day after another, any resemblance between what he says and the truth is a matter of coincidence. You know, it is absolutely a matter of coincidence. I'm not saying he's never accurate. I'm saying he's only accurate when it suits him, when it suits his own political purpose. And we've seen him distort and misrepresent and spread falsehoods on one issue after another. And, Mr. Speaker, it's so touching to see the way he wants to be the ferocious class warrior. Oh, yes, Bill Shorten, defender of the poor.
The Prime Minister will refer to members by their correct titles. And the member for Sydney is again delaying the Manager of Opposition Business. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On three matters, Mr. Speaker. First of all, addressing members by their correct title. Secondly, on direct relevance. And thirdly, I thought I'd give him a chance to read the document.
No, in fact, actually, while the Manager of Opposition Business is on his feet, he might remain on his feet. There's a line here, and we're very close to it, so the Manager of Opposition Business can grab that bit of paper back. The Leader of the Opposition's already sought leave to table it. It's been rejected. No, I don't want you to do that. I do not want to eject you under 94A. I really don't. Thank you. The Prime Minister's been asked a question which I listened to very carefully. The member for Lingiari will cease interjecting. Whoever else is bellowing in my left ear will cease interjecting. And the Prime Minister was asked a question, yes, about negative gearing, but with a preamble and a fairly broad tagline. And I'm listening to the Prime Minister carefully. He's only about halfway through the answer.
Yeah,
and I'll keep listening to it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition, in his unlikely pose as a tribune of the people, a champion of the oppressed and the downtrodden. Yes, this is the person he stood up for the workers at Chiquita Mushrooms, didn't he? Absolutely sold them down the river. And what about Clean Event? What about Clean Event and his friend Caesar Mellon? Did he ever call up Caesar and say, Caesar, that was disgraceful? No, absolutely not. He's his best friend, champions him, parachutes him into the Victorian Parliament. It is competing between Caesar Mellon, who sells workers down the river, takes payments for the union. He was talking about kickbacks yesterday. Well, I no doubt kickbacks are on his mind when you read what's in the papers about Caesar Mellon being investigated for corrupt practices as recommended by the Hayden Commission. But then, of course, not content with promoting Caesar, he then picks up comes on Kimberley Kitching and puts her in the Senate. This is somebody who is filling in safety forms, safety examinations for other people, putting workers' lives at risk. What is her reward? A seat in the Senate from the Labor Party.
The Prime Minister's time has expired. The member for Moore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the government's economic reforms are delivering strong jobs growth? How will the restoration of the Australian Building and Construction Commission support the 1 million Australians employed in the building and construction sector?
The Prime Minister.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr Speaker, the honourable member raises a critical point that shows the clear line between the pro-growth policies of the government and the anti-business, anti-investment, anti-jobs policies of the Labor Party. The Labor Party at the election, by its own admission, would blow the budget out by $16.5 billion. They owned up to that. They would push for more protectionist policies that we know will cost jobs. Their left wing, to which the Leader of the Opposition is increasingly captive, rail against the free trade agreements which we know are delivering jobs across Australia. Mr Speaker, right now in the Parliament this week, the Labor Party stands against the restoration of the rule of law to the construction sector. Not content with their opposition to the Registered Organisations Bill, not content with trying to protect union officials that rip off their members, that corruptly deal with the hard-working members' dues that go to those unions, now they stand against the restoration of the rule of law to the construction sector. Why do they do that? They do that because they are a wholly owned subsidiary of one of the most militant unions in the country, the CFMEU. And it is a signal of the way in which Labor has changed that Bob Hawke deregistered the Builders Labourers Federation. The Leader of the Opposition defends their successor, the construction wing of the CFMEU. And, Mr Speaker, it's little wonder that the Leader of the Opposition does this. He has consistently backed the union bosses against the workers. We see the reports today that his close ally and friend, Caesar Melham, is under investigation by the Fair Work Commission for the allegations that he entered into secret side deals and kickbacks. He was named by the Hayden Royal Commission as being suspect of corrupt practices. And this is a fundamental issue of the integrity of the Labor Party. Are they prepared to stand up for the rule of law? Whether it is in the management of unions, we know the answer to that is no. They oppose the Registered Organisations Bill. Are they prepared to stand up for the rule of law in the construction sector? We know the answer to that is no. The Labor Party of 2016 is not the party of Bob Hawke or Paul Keating. It is a party captured, dominated and controlled by militant unions and the bosses that exploit their members.
The member for Hunter.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Was the President of the National Farmers Federation accurate this morning when describing the government's chaotic handling of the backpacker tax? And I quote her, "We were absolutely blindsided by an item in the budget that came in that we weren't consulted about."
The member for Hunter will just resume his seat, perhaps somewhere convenient if the Manager Opposition moves his books. I've cautioned members many times on interjecting while a question's on. The member for Deakin is warned. The member for Hunter will begin his question again.
Stick to your Chrissy cards, Mick.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Was the President of the National Farmers Federation accurate this morning when describing the government's chaotic handling of the backpacker tax? And I quote her, "We were absolutely blindsided by an item in the budget that came in that we weren't consulted about that said that they were going to put the backpacker tax up to 32% from 0%.
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'd like to congratulate him. He's made it to question number 2. It's an auspicious day. And I'm not quite sure about what happened in the budget. I imagine they found a badger in the budget. I'm not quite sure what you do with the budget. But what I can say is that the backpacker tax for the rate that led to 32.5% was brought about by Mr. Wayne Swan, who now sits as a member for Lilly. He's the person who brought about.
The Deputy Prime Minister resume his seat. And stop interjecting, Member for Grayndler. The Manager of Opposition Business, on a point of order.
Not addressing members by their title. Again.
The Deputy Prime Minister needs to address members by their correct title. It would also help. It would also help. This might take a long time. You know. I haven't called the Deputy Prime Minister yet. The Deputy Prime Minister will just. The Deputy Prime Minister, you don't have the call. I haven't finished addressing the House. It's early in question time. In response to the Manager Opposition Business, yes, the Deputy Prime Minister will refer to members by their correct titles. He will assist the Speaker in hearing everything the Deputy Prime Minister says if the level of interjections are lower. I'd like to ask the House to lower the volume or I'll start doing it. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know that they'll get very excited when the member for Hunter gets a question. And I can understand why they would raise their voices. But it's very important to understand that it's the former Treasurer, now the member for Lilly, and he seems to be here for a fair while, that the reason we had a 32.5% rate is by reason of the actions of the previous government, the Labor government. And of course, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal brought about the result.
The member for Sydney and the member for Gorton.
That meant that we had to have that we had to not allow them to get the tax-free threshold. Now, what we did was we made sure that
the Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
We made sure that we had a long form of investigation, a long form of report that included the NFF. The NFF was part of it. The VFF was part of it. The Northern Territory farmers were part of it. And when we came to an agreement on a rate, the rate was 19%, and everybody agreed to it. That
members on my left will cease interjecting. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Anyway, but of course the problem was that the Leader of the Opposition and the member for Maribyrnong, he went into an agreement, of course, with the Senator for Tasmania, Jackie Lambie, where his senior economic advice comes from. This led to the ridiculous position, which they were basically going to try and blow the show up, because that's what he's really on about. He's a person who can't be trusted. He's duplicitous in his actions of how he goes about it. He's a person who has no interest in actually bringing about a result. He just wants to fight. He just wants to fight, and he probably gets that desire, that zeal from the fight from his days in the union. Where they can go into an area where there is resolve and create chaos. Now, of course, the dilemma that we were placed in is we made the promise that we'd resolve this issue by the time that the rate went back to 32.5%, which was the 1st of January next year. We made that promise, we honoured that promise, we delivered on that promise. And right now, the Labor Party still holds to their promise of a 10.5% rate. So does the member for Maribyrnong, is he going to stand up now and show his authenticity, show he's not duplicit by saying he stands behind the 10.5% rate? Will you do that?
Minister's
of course
time
he won't.
has expired. The member for Bowman.
Question to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on the findings of the latest OECD report on the continued strong performance of the Australian economy? How's the government working to strengthen our economic performance to promote higher wages, more employment and greater job security for hard-working Australians?
The Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bowman for his question. Despite the
Member for
numerous
Gorton will
challenges,
cease
Mr.
interjecting.
Speaker,
That's his
that
final
we face
warning.
economically, the low world growth, the weak trade growth, low wages growth, which is characteristic of all the advanced economies around the world, which is pointed out in the OECD report, despite the fact that we are transitioning from a once-in-a-lifetime mining investment boom, and despite the fact that we are dealing with the erosion of what has been a century-old coal-based energy advantage, which has been receding, Mr. Speaker, cheered on by those opposite, as they've cheered on the closure of places like Hazelwood and others, Mr. Speaker. And the uneven impact of globalisation and technological change around the world, but also particularly here in this country as well. The OECD confirms again in this report today, Mr. Speaker, that the Australian economy leads the advanced world. Our rate of growth continues to be higher than the OECD average, as it has indeed been since this government was first elected in 2013 and every single year. And the Turnbull government is committed to ensuring that we continue the pro-growth, pro-investment, pro-higher real wages, pro-employment, pro-jobs growth policies, which involves supporting businesses to be able to give workers more wages, more hours, so they can increase their standards of living. We are growing faster than Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Netherlands, Japan, Singapore, New Zealand, Mr. Speaker. All of this pointed out in the OECD report today. Our jobs growth is higher than the OECD average, and indeed our unemployment rate is lower than the OECD average, Mr. Speaker. This country has enjoyed, and not through any lack of effort from the hard-working Australians who have been out there making this happen for the last 25 years of consecutive annual economic growth. This is an extraordinary achievement, Mr. Speaker, that is the product of the hard-working Australians who have been out there making it happen for 25 years, the investment of businesses and the good policy settings which were followed by the Hawke-Keating government and the Howard Costello government, and these are policies that this side of the House continues to honour, Mr. Speaker. We continue to pursue those policies and support those policies that set up 25 years of consecutive economic growth. Those opposite, Mr. Speaker, have abandoned those policies. Those opposite have abandoned the policies, economic policies of Bob Hawke to adopt the economic policies of Bob Brown. They take economic growth for granted and they assume they can continue to tax Australian businesses, tax Australian small businesses, tax hard-working Australians even more and more and more, whether they invest, whether they work, whether they save. Their answer is to tax hard-working Australians more and more. That's not how you grow an economy.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Last week in question time, the Deputy Prime Minister said the current funding for the promised 450 gigalitres was insufficient, saying, and I quote, "You have not got a hope in Hades of delivering 450 gigs, not a hope." 1 week later, is that still the Deputy Prime Minister's position?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the opportunity to bring to light the fact that we are dealing with a basin plan that was actually written by the Labor Party, a basin plan for which all the incongruities were orchestrated by the Labor Party. And it's interesting to see that the Labor Party has not suggested what we really need. We need the Leader of the Opposition to come to the dispatch box and start suggesting what the solutions are. Of course, with absolute, and I'll take the interjection, as laid out in the basin plan, as completely laid out in the basin plan, as written by the Australian Labor Party. As written by the Australian Labor Party, we look forward to it. As the member for Watson knows, it prescribes the amount in there, doesn't it, the member for Watson? $1.77 billion. That's correct, isn't it, the member for Watson? Just nod. That's correct, isn't it? And after you take out the works and measures for $200 million, it leaves you $1.57 billion. Isn't that correct, the member for Watson? And this is exactly what's in the basin plan. Isn't that correct, the member for Watson? And that is part, and at part 17.2 Part B, it describes the conditions on which you can spend that money, doesn't it, the member for Watson? Yes. And you wrote it, didn't you, the member for Watson? Yes. So all the problems are your problems.
Member for Kingston. The member for Kingston will cease interjecting. Just before I call the member for Melbourne, we have present in the gallery this afternoon two former members of this House, the member for Solomon, Natasha Griggs, and Louise Marcus, the former member for Greenway. We just welcome you both again, and I call the member for Melbourne.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Environment and Energy. In a Senate committee report tabled yesterday, Australia's biggest power company, AGL, which runs coal-fired generators like Loy Yang in Victoria and Bayswater in New South Wales, called for a clear national plan for the orderly retirement of coal-fired generators. For the first time ever, the companies running coal-fired power stations are joining with affected communities, unions and environment groups in calling for a government-led, orderly and just transition to a clean economy. Minister, will you do what the Senate committee report recommended and take a plan to the December meeting of the COAG Energy Council, or for this government is plan still just another four-letter word?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the member for Melbourne for his question. And just last week I got a question from the member for Melbourne, and I said when he was thinking up that question he was sipping his latte, putting his sandals up on the table in Brunswick Street. But lo and behold, after question time, the member for Melbourne put out a press release. And he said he was offended because I was playing the man, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I take this opportunity to apologise to the member for Melbourne because I found out he's not a latte man, he's a mocha man, Mr. Speaker. And they weren't the sandals, they were thinking man sandals. You put your Birkenstocks up on the table, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, we are dealing with a transition in the Australian energy sector. We have seen 8 out of the 12 most emission-intensive power stations close over the last 5 years, and with the announcement that Hazelwood will close at the end of March next year, that will be 9. There is a transition. But the member for Melbourne referred to the report that was tabled in the Parliament and the Senate yesterday, dare I say leaked by somebody who knows who, to the media before it was officially tabled. But it's always important, isn't it, to go, when you're looking at the reports that are being named by the member for Melbourne, to look at some of the evidence that was put before that Senate inquiry. And we went to the Hansard. And there was evidence given to this Senate report on coal-fired power stations from the director of the Mining, Chemicals and Energy Workers Union in Germany, a Mr. Mersman. Now, Mr. Mersman was brought out here by the ACTU. And you would think that he was brought out by Labor to give evidence to a coal power plant inquiry, that he would say it's the end of coal. But he was asked this question by our colleague, Senator Hume. How many coal-fired power stations are being built in Germany? Mr. Mersman, 4 or 5, Mr. Speaker. And then the next question from Senator Hume. Is coal-fired power being imported into Germany from Poland? The answer from Mr. Mersman, yes, of course, Mr. Speaker. And was he asked what's happened to electricity prices, and he says they have increased. So, Mr. Speaker, the bottom line is every country is different. In Australia, 60% of our power is being generated by coal. And we have a transition plan which involves putting energy security at number 1. We are dealing with a trilemma of issues: energy security, energy affordability and a lower emissions future. We will not sacrifice blue-collar jobs in the regions in order to win Green votes in the city, which is not just the position of the Greens, but unfortunately has been now joined by the Labor Party, who are in partnership with the Greens, a bit like they were during Julia Gillard and Bob Brown's time.
The member for Flynn.
Speaker, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House how the ABCC will benefit the agricultural sector and restore the rule of law on construction sites around the country? What hurdles stand in the way to achieving this reform?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Flynn for his question and note the promise that was made at the election for the $215,000 preliminary study to connect Gladstone to Toowoomba, to connect it up to the Inland Rail, to extend that corridor of commerce from Melbourne through all the way to Gladstone. And also note the $45 million of the Gladstone Boardwalk project that the CFMEU went in and did all their very best in their thuggish way and threatened workers to try and extend this project to extort money out of the people, of the taxpayers. And obviously what we always realise is, of course, the people building the project just put it on the price. The people who pay are the taxpayers. The people who pay are the mum and dads who have to buy the houses. The people who pay is everybody else. It's almost like there's a cultural clique within the Labor Party that believes that the CFMEU has a right to extort this money off other people, and you can see this in the action. In Sydney Morning Herald, this was definitely said outside the parliament, published on May 24th, 2015, it says that Hardkiss gave evidence at the Royal Commission that Sean Reardon had made late-night threatening phone calls to a female work inspector. At the time, Reardon was a white-ribbon anti-domestic violence ambassador. The pattern of intimidation goes back a long way. In March, Justice Tracy of the Federal Court found that several CFMEU officials, including John Setka, Sean Reardon, Craig Johnson, had engaged in acts of intimidation in 2012 during a dispute in the Melbourne Central Business District of a construction company. The judge found that the workers met protesters led by Setka and Reardon and Johnson. It's calling them scabs, dogs, rats. You will die. I'm going to kill your family. This is the sort of culture in the CFMEU. And it goes on. In the AFR, we find that a wonderful and very interesting man, Luke Collier,
Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Grayndler on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker, and you won't be surprised it's on direct relevance. The question was about extending a non-existent railway line to somewhere else in Queensland.
Member for Grayndler will resume his seat. The Deputy Prime Minister, I'm listening to carefully. The question was about that and other matters as well.
So Mr Luke Collier called a female inspector an effing S-blank-T, asking her if she had bought knee pads, as you're going to be sucking off these effing dogs all day. This is in the paper, in the Financial Review. And of course, the Deputy
Prime Minister will resume his seat. If members were to look back several months ago on language that was used whilst it was being quoted, a quote does not of itself obviate the need for proper parliamentary language. This matter has been addressed in the Senate. I'm practical on the matter, but the Deputy Prime Minister has now strayed beyond what's acceptable. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. I refer to the Deputy Prime Minister's earlier answer. As a result of water entitlement prices doubling in some major catchments of the Murray-Darling Basin, has the Deputy Prime Minister been trying to secure additional funds to guarantee the 450 gigalitres can be delivered, or has the Deputy Prime Minister been trying to cut government funding to the Murray-Darling Basin?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and thought he might understand his own act, which he wrote, which should know full well, if he was competent, that there's a review in 2019. You would remember writing that, wouldn't you?
The member for Maranoa.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment. Will the minister outline why it's important to restore the rule of law on building sites across the country? How does this compare with the approach to the union movement in other countries?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Maranoa for his question. And he would know that it is important to restore the rule of law on building and construction sites in Australia by bringing back the Australian Building and Construction Commission, because he would know, as most members do on this side of the House, that the last time the ABCC existed, it saved consumers $7.5 billion in costs and it increased productivity by 16% in the building and construction sector while the ABCC was in place, and that's one of the reasons it needs to be brought back into existence. Now, Mr Speaker, our approach to building and construction sites and bringing back the rule of law and bringing the unions to heel with respect to building and construction is very fair, and it's very middle of the road. I'm asked how this compares to other countries, and one of the countries which I'd like to compare it to, Mr Speaker, is Cuba, because I've noticed, Mr Speaker, an outpouring of praise for the former president of Cuba, Fidel Castro, in the last 24 hours from members of the Labor Party. But here's what the Human Rights Watch had to say about Fidel Castro's Cuba. Under Fidel Castro, the Cuban government refused to recognise the legitimacy of Cuban human rights organisations, alternative political parties, independent labour unions or the free press. He denied the Red Cross and Human Rights Watch access to the island to investigate human rights conditions. So Fidel Castro actually suppressed independent unions in Cuba, a much more extreme measure than the government is taking to try and restore the rule of law. But in the last 24 hours, Labor appears to have rediscovered their inner communists, Mr Speaker, because our old friend Senator Kim Carr, this is what he said on the passing of Fidel Castro. Vale Fidel Castro, extraordinary 20th century figure, survived 50-year embargo and 638 CIA attempts on life using ex-lovers. That's kind of in the weird category. That's in the weird category, Mr Speaker. But the member for Hindmarsh, he said Fidel Castro went from law student to revolutionary leader, communist figurehead and polarising global icon, R.I.P. Fidel. This guy's on first-name basis with Fidel Castro. R.I.P. Fidel. I suppose he calls the Ceausescu's Nikolai and Elena as well, does he, Mr Speaker? Now, Mr Speaker, it doesn't stop there. Troy Bramston, he exposed today that Shorten often has talked about seeing Castro give one of his speeches that went for hours. It was amazing, Shorten gushed. It was amazing. Oh, Lord, save us from soft-boiled lefties.
The member for Leichhardt is warned, and the member for Adelaide has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Can the Deputy Prime Minister assure the House that there are no documents which confirm that the government considered cutting funding to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, once more, they would know full well that the $1.77 billion is legislated. It's in the legislation. It's in the legislation. So I imagine if they want to talk to the member for Watson, who wrote the plan, if you've got any problems, there's the gentleman to speak to. He's about 4 seats down from you. He would also inform you, maybe he would or would not know, that if there was any changes to the $1.77 billion, it'd be brought into here. It's part of the legislation. It's part of the legislation. So really what you should be addressing your question to the architect of the issue, which is a member for Watson. And there he is.
The member for Hughes.
My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will the minister advise the House on the importance of strengthening international relationships in support of our national interest? Is the minister aware of any alternate approaches that would threaten our national interest?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Hughes for his question and acknowledge his ongoing interest in foreign policy and defence matters. Now, Mr Speaker, the Australian government is strengthening our bilateral relationships to boost our national security and deliver economic outcomes that benefit Australians. In other words, keeping Australians safe and providing job opportunities for Australians. Our free trade deals with China, Japan and South Korea have enabled Australians to export their goods and services to new and dynamic markets. We have enhanced our security ties and increased intelligence sharing in our region to keep Australians safe. Relationships matter, Mr Speaker, and an important way to build these stronger relationships is in the exchange of young people, and under reciprocal arrangements with more than 30 other nations, tens of thousands of young Australians undertake working holidays in other countries each year, while we welcome tens of thousands of young people from Europe and North and South America and Asia to working holidays here. It is reciprocal. Now, Mr Speaker, the contrast with Labor is stark and their hypocrisy is profound. The opposition leader attacks overseas workers despite approving record numbers while he was the relevant minister. I have to say, the opposition leader's inflammatory words demonising foreigners who work in Australia risks damaging those reciprocal working holiday arrangements which have built goodwill among nations and millions of young people from around the world. And it's in our interest to have these young workers here, particularly to fill some labour force requirements in some sectors.
Member for Wakefield.
But the opposition leader has form on the hypocrisy
And the member
front.
for Gellibrand.
Remember when the opposition leader called for greater engagement in Asia and then insulted Japan, a key strategic partner, by invoking past military aggression. Now, that was an attack that even Troy Bramston, a former Labor
Member for
advisor,
Wakefield is
described
warned.
as racist rhetoric. And then remember when the opposition leader supported that disgraceful xenophobic campaign by the CFMEU against the China Free Trade Agreement, insulting China, opposing jobs for Australians just to curry favour with union thugs. This reckless opposition leader talks of the importance of the US alliance and then describes the incoming president as barking mad just so he can curry favour with the Greens. Mr Speaker, Mark Latham, remember him? The man Labor wanted as Prime Minister put it well when he said the opposition leader was an opportunist with a shameless record of using people and political issues to satisfy his personal ambitions. Couldn't put it any better.
Member for Sydney. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday in question time, the Prime Minister was asked whether the Attorney-General had given the Solicitor-General a verbal instruction not to run a particular argument in the High Court, a question that the Prime Minister and the Attorney-General have repeatedly refused to answer. So I ask again, did the Attorney give this instruction, yes or no?
The Prime Minister has
Thank
the
you,
call.
Mr Speaker. I dealt with that matter yesterday by
on my
referring the honourable member to the Attorney's comprehensive statement delivered in the Senate.
The member for Menzies.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Can the minister update the House on the steps that the government is taking to ensure the effective management of the 457 visa program, and how does this compare to any other approaches?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. It's one of the great achievements of this government that we've created 500,000 jobs since we've come into government, and that is something all Australians should be very proud of. We are working hard to get Australians into work and to get our economy pumping right across the nation. Mr Speaker, the 457 visa program enables employers to employ a foreign worker if the position can't be filled by an Australian worker, and there's quite a process that that employers need to go through before they can employ one of these workers. And we saw yesterday that the Daily Telegraph had a story in relation to the Leader of the Opposition, because he claimed to be the great friend of the Australian worker and to put Australian workers first. But as it turned out, the Leader of the Opposition, when he was in government, as the Employment Minister, had signed off on a special deal for McDonald's and KFC to employ foreign workers over Australian workers. So we've seen example after example over the course of the last 12 months or so of this Leader of the Opposition being completely untrustworthy. You can't trust a word that this Leader of the Opposition says. He says one thing in here and something very different when he gets outside. And the difficulty for the Leader of the Opposition is that his hypocrisy doesn't just stop with the agreement for McDonald's, because, as the Foreign Minister pointed out before, the Leader of the Opposition was out there railing against the free trade agreement with the people of the Republic of China, and the reality is he was doing something very different when he was the Employment Minister. He was out there saying that he wanted to put Australians first, and yet we see in the Daily Telly today that the then Employment Minister, the now
Member for Sydney,
Leader of the Opposition, signed off on a deal to support 800 Chinese workers who were sponsored by a single Chinese-owned construction company to work at the Sino Iron project in Western Australia. Now, I want to ask you how that is consistent with some of the words of the Leader of the Opposition. If I just quote a couple, and there are plenty, we can come back to it on another day, but this is a Leader of the Opposition. I quote, "If there's a project which is $150 million plus in Western Australia, say a hotel or a construction development, I want to see West Australian riggers and dogmen get jobs. I want to see Western Australian carpenters, labourers and mechanics and designers and draftspeople get those jobs. I'm saying that I want Australians to get the first chance to work on our projects." When did it become so unacceptable to stand up for Australian jobs, he said, so sincerely at the time. There are plenty of households in the Canning electorate where you've got to get trained construction workers, where you've got to get people with the sort of skills that you can work on projects. I'll tell you what, Mr Speaker, don't trust a word that Bill Shorten says. Don't trust a word that this Leader of the Opposition
Minister will
says.
resume his
He's a
seat. The Minister will refer to members by their correct titles. I've warned him on this before. Member for Isaacs can just relax for a second. Just relax. It'll be okay. You're going to get the call. I've cautioned the Minister on this before. There's a ruling I refer members to. I'll be taking further action for recidivists, okay, on the subject. We're not going to just keep asking the Minister for withdrawal. He'll force me to take further action if it persists. The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
My question.
No, the Minister will withdraw. No, the member for Gorton has already been warned.
I withdraw.
He's about to leave before. I haven't called the Minister yet. I'm sorry. The Minister will withdraw.
I withdraw, Mr Speaker.
Member for Isaacs. Might be good if he moves as quickly as he normally does, I think. Member for
Thank you,
Isaacs.
Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister, on behalf of the Commonwealth, waive legal privilege in relation to the government's communications with the Solicitor-General about the WA kickback scandal so the truth can be revealed?
The Leader of the House. Leader of the House is delaying the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The only kickback scandal that is being investigated today is the one relating to Caesar Mellum and the Fair Work Commission. That's what's being investigated today, and it's that type. It is that type of corruption that the opposition seeks to protect by its trenchant resistance to the reforms represented by the Registered Organisations Bill, happily passed now by the Parliament, and their continued opposition to the restoration of the Australian Building and Construction Commission. They're the kickbacks fingered by the Hayden Royal Commission, exposed. And what have those responsible for it? What has happened to them? They've been rewarded. Caesar Mellum, the Leader of the Opposition's protégé in the Australian Workers' Union, now sits in the Victorian Parliament. And of course Kimberley Kitching, who was also recommended to be considered for prosecution by the Hayden Royal Commission, now sits in the Senate. So that is the pathway for those who break the law, those who defy the law in the Labor movement today. This is not the Labor Party of Bob Hawke. He stood up to crooked unions. The party that the Leader of the Opposition leads today defends them again and again.
The member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister update the House on how the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement is delivering new export opportunities for Australian businesses and creating jobs for hard-working Australians? Is the Minister aware of any risks to these growing opportunities?
Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment.
Here we go.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for O'Connor for his question. I know he's passionate about the fact that on the 20th of December it will be the first anniversary of the Coalition's historic China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. This is an agreement which has seen, of course, Australian exports grow significantly. In fact, the growth of the export of mangoes, for example, has increased to 165%. China is now our biggest export destination when it comes to Australian wine. And what is this actually all about? It's providing Australian businesses preferential market access into the world's second-largest economy and our largest trading partner. And that's great news, because it's about creating Australian jobs. And let's not forget, though, Mr Speaker, that in fact it was, of course, the Australian Labor Party and the CFMEU that we saw run a campaign against the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. In fact, we saw the CFMEU run one of the most dishonest campaigns that we've seen in Australian public life, and they pumped tens of millions of dollars into that dishonest campaign in the same way that they pumped tens of millions of dollars into the Australian Labor Party. And this opposition that came from the CFMEU and that walking both sides of the street from the Leader of the Opposition happened despite the fact that former Labor luminaries like Bob Hawke and Paul Keating called for the agreement to be passed. And in fact, the former Labor Party president, Warren Mundine, said, and I quote, this is the former Labor Party president, he said, "It's embarrassing watching Labor dance around while they oppose CHAFTA. And having lived under the shadow of racism my whole life, the bigoted anti-CHAFTA campaign makes me deeply angry." That's the condemnation from the president of the Australian Labor Party. But the fact is, it isn't actually just our side of the House that's focused on trade deals, because I can tell you all, the Leader of the Opposition does have some interest in trade. We're focused on trade. That's good for Australian workers. The Leader of the Opposition is focused on trade. That's good for him, and good, in fact, for the trade union movement at the expense of Australian workers, because this bloke has form. We know from, for example, Clean Event, that he was happy to trade away the payments and the wages to Australian workers in order to boost the union movement. And as a further indication that the Leader of the Opposition is actually more focused on what he can do to boost the unions, he's also walked away from the heritage of the Australian Labor Party. In fact, this bloke's more Castro than he is Keating, and that's a simple fact. A lot of them are looking confused because they're not sure whether that's a compliment or an insult. But let me assure you, it's not meant as a compliment. So the simple fact, Mr Speaker, is the Australian Labor Party is a shadow of its former self. They'll do a deal to benefit the union over the top of Australian workers every day of every week.
The member for Isaacs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to his previous answer. The Bell Group case began in the High Court in November 2015. A barrister appeared for the Commonwealth in the High Court on the 8th of February in the Bell Group case. How is it possible that the Attorney-General was not aware of this litigation until March?
Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the honourable gentleman's asking me to express an opinion on the state of mind of the Attorney-General, to hypothesise about the Attorney-General. The simple reality is this. The simple reality is this, and I think the member for Isaacs' constant obsession with the Attorney-General is one that we have all indulged. We have all indulged it. We put up with it. His colleagues find it humorous. I think all of us now find it tiresome. Let's just set a few obvious facts into context. The first thing is that the Bell Group litigation had been going on for 20 years. It had become a modern Jarndyce and Jarndyce, chewing up the assets of the estate of Bell Group to the detriment, inevitably, of the creditors. That so much, I think, is perfectly plain. The West Australian government sought to find a solution to bring the litigation to an end. They introduced
the member for Burt will leave under 94A
in the West Australian Parliament, which was challenged in the High Court. In the final event, as honourable members know, the Australian Taxation Office was represented, the Commonwealth was represented. The legislation was struck down on a basis that I suspect the honourable member and I might be able to find common ground on this at least, which was, I think, fairly predictable, and it came to an end. But the reality is that the interests of the Commonwealth were always protected, the interests of the ATO were always protected, but it has to be said this endless litigation is continuing, and the only beneficiaries are the members of the legal profession.
The members for Hume and Shortland are warned. Member for Fisher.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Urban Infrastructure. Will the minister explain to the House the importance of restoring the rule of law to construction sites, ensuring hard-working Australians are getting value for money on major infrastructure projects? Is the minister aware of how these benefits might be threatened?
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure.
Well, I do thank the member for Fisher for his question. Of course, he brings enormous and relevant experience to this chamber as not only a former barrister but as a former builder. And he is absolutely right to ask about the rule of law on construction sites, Mr Speaker, because in 2016-17 the Commonwealth Government will invest some $9 billion on transport infrastructure, and we are determined to get value for money on behalf of taxpayers. Now, unfortunately, the construction sector is marked by aggressive union activity, and as Master Builders Queensland has noted, a unionised worksite can add up to 30% of the cost of construction, and that's what comes from thuggery and criminality and corruption on building sites. Tricks like sudden walk-offs in the middle of concrete pours that the CFMEU is so fond of, Mr Speaker. That is why it is so important to re-establish the Australian Building and Construction Commission and the rule of law on building sites. But I'm asked if there is any threat to this approach, and it turns out, Mr Speaker, that there are some in this place who take a different view to the coalition about the role of unions on major infrastructure programs, who are happy, in fact, for dodgy union officials to get whatever they can out of the companies building the projects. Let me quote from the Trade Union Royal Commission, which describes the approach of one union on the Eastlink Tunnel project in Melbourne. In 2005, there was an agreement to pay $100,000 a year to that union by Tees John Holland, disguised by false invoices. And let me quote, "The genesis of the agreement was a proposal by Mr X." I say Mr X, Mr Speaker, in deference to your rulings, a proposal by Mr X to Stephen Sass in late 2004 that the joint venture provide financial support to the AWU in relation to the dedication of an organiser of the project. Now, the report also says that a Mr Caesar Mellum, who we can think of as Mr X's little mate, assumed primary conduct of the negotiation. And the case study gives us an approach into the principles followed by Mr X, by Caesar Mellum and by all of the gang at the AWU, the CFMEU and all of those other unions. We might call it the render unto Caesar what is Caesar's principle, because that is really the approach. When you look at the evidence given on oath, it seems that Mr X and Caesar and all the gang took a very expansive view of what is Caesar's. Clean event where Caesar and Mr X and the gang picked up $25,000 a year. ACI, 3 instalments of $160,000. Chiquita mushrooms, and of course Caesar felt that what should be rendered unto Caesar was to be appointed as a Labor member of the Victorian Upper House. Who was it who was named first on his nomination form? It was, of course, Mr X, our old friend, the Leader of the Opposition.
The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. At exactly this time last year, the Prime Minister stood at the dispatch box and expressed full confidence in Ministers Briggs, Brough and the member for Fadden. 1 year on, in the last week of this parliament for this year, will the Prime Minister express the same full confidence in the Attorney-General?
Yeah. The Prime Minister.
Of course I do.
The member for Groom.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Speaker, my constituency question.
Member for Groom will just pause. Leader of the House and the Treasurer. The member for Lingiari, the Leader of the House, I presume more than most, wants the member for Groom to ask his question. The member for Groom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My constituency question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs. Could the minister please advise the House how the government plans to harness the skills and increase employment of veterans in our communities?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs.
This is a good question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Groom for this question and for his interest and advocacy for the defence community in his electorate. Groom is home to nearly 2,000 veterans and their families, and it has a strong military presence at Oakey and at Kabala. Mr Speaker, 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister launched the Prime Minister's Veterans Employment Program. This was an initiative which the Prime Minister was happy to put his name to. As a matter of fact, he showed his keen interest in making sure that this initiative would be a success by first announcing it in the Cabinet room when he invited ex-Defence Service organisations into the Cabinet room to explain to them what he would like to do. Then 2 weeks ago, he invited leaders of industry and representatives of business, both large and small, to Kirribilli to launch this program. Mr Speaker, it is an incredibly important program, and can I recognise the opposition spokesperson for Defence, Richard Marles, who came along and made this launch a bipartisan initiative. Mr Speaker, the best thing that we can do for our veterans when they leave serving is to make sure that they can transition to a job. And this is what this program is all about, and ensuring that the men and women who serve in our Defence Forces can transition to a job is absolutely vital, and will require the support not only of government but also the support of industry and the community to make sure that we can get this right. Our defence personnel, when they leave the military, as we have seen, can go on to be Governor-Generals. They can go on to serve in this place. They can go on to be captains of industry. They can go on to head small businesses, large businesses, because they bring with them skills such as discipline, such as teamwork, such as hard work. All that is absolutely vital for our businesses. And can I appeal to every member in this House that every time that you're meeting with business leaders, please encourage them to remember the skills that our Defence Force personnel can bring to their workplaces, because if they do that, they will be doing what the Prime Minister has said on a number of occasions. The best way that we can pay homage to those who served in 1916, the best way we can commemorate their service is to ensure that we look after the defence personnel and the veterans in 2016.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Assistant Treasurer and the Minister for Revenue, and it refers to the answer she gave yesterday in relation to her responsibilities for the ATO. Has the Minister or her office received any written correspondence from the Attorney-General about the WA kickback scandal? And will the Minister now undertake to the House to table all documents related to the scandal?
Hear, hear. The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services.
There's no such thing. There's no scandal.
I thank the member for her question, and as I said in the House yesterday, I am responsible for the ATO. I have absolutely sought advice from the ATO in relation to the Bell litigation matter, and they have given very clear advice that they needed to ensure that they intervened
Member for
in
Jagga.
the High Court proceedings, and I supported them fully in that action. Now, when it comes to correspondence that I have received from other members of parliament, I'm very happy to check my records and report back to the House.
The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Environment and Energy. Despite Australia having an abundance of cheap natural energy sources, especially in the regions such as my electorate of Flynn, residents and businesses are struggling under the weight of ever-increasing power bills. Can the Minister inform the House what action the federal government is taking to see that affordable and reliable electricity is available to everyone?
Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Flynn for his question and acknowledge the fact that within his electorate there are many energy-intensive industries, like the Boynes aluminium smelter, which employs around 1,000 people near Gladstone. The fact that on Curtis Island there have been 3 major LNG projects seeing tens of billions of dollars worth of investment and tens of thousands of jobs being created. But businesses are doing it tough in Queensland with rising electricity prices, and we heard just recently from the Australian Energy Regulator that more than 20,000 households have faced disconnections and are doing it tough as a result of rising energy prices. Now, this is why the Turnbull government, working through the COAG Energy Council, is determined to put downward pressure on energy prices, is determined to ensure energy security is maintained as we transition to a lower emissions future. And we're doing that in a number of ways. We're doing that by seeking a review of the limited merits process whereby the networks can appeal a decision of the Australian Energy Regulator. We're doing that by trying to get more liquidity and transparency into the domestic gas markets, and particularly the pipeline operators, as well as pushing the states to lift some of these moratoriums on the exploration and development of both conventional and non-conventional reserves. We have commissioned Australia's Chief Scientist, Alan Finkel, in order to undertake a review of energy security, and we are pursuing a realistic renewable energy target of 23.5% by 2020. But, Mr Speaker, we're not getting any help from Labor state governments, particularly the one in Queensland, because the one in Queensland has a 50% renewable energy target by 2030, even though today it only has about 5% of its power coming from renewables. Now, the Grattan Institute, no political truck with the Grattan Institute, it's called this magic pudding economics. It's described it as an economic illusion. Even the Stanwell, the government-owned power generator, has raised its concerns, and a former Labor Queensland Treasurer of 7 years standing, Keith de Lacy, has said that this will have a significant impact on living standards and economic growth. Well, what about what the fixer said, Graham Richardson, who's described these policies as a farce, as stupid, as hurting economic growth, Mr Speaker? So you don't have to take it from me. You can take it from some of the Labor statesmen who have criticised their own policies. And the fact that in Queensland it will cost an extra $27 billion will not help the Boynes aluminium smelter in the seat of Flynn, will not help the LNG facilities on Curtis Island. Only the coalition can be trusted.
The minister's time has expired. The member for Bendigo. Again, the member for Rankin.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's previous answers and to a new report that he has divested his interests in a vulture fund which profited from foreclosing on the homes of Hurricane Katrina victims. Why has the Prime Minister now suddenly decided to avoid investing in funds that exploit vulnerable people? And will the Prime Minister finally sell his holdings in managed funds which invest in 7-Eleven, a company which is notorious for exploiting workers?
The members on my right. The Minister for Urban Infrastructure. The Minister for Urban Infrastructure will cease interjecting. The member for Bowman will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
The honourable member The honourable member would be well aware, no doubt, that I can't speak for his own investments, but many of his colleagues are invested in Australian super.
The member for Rankin will not interject.
A company with which his leader was a director of.
Prime Minister will resume his seat for a second. The member for Rankin has a nasty habit of interjecting as soon as he's asked a question. He's been warned. If he interjects again, he'll be hearing the rest of the answer outside the chamber. Members on my right will cease interjecting as well. The Prime Minister has the call.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think I've explained to the House before the approach that Lucy and I take to our investments, and they are allocated by a financial advisor, and for the most part they are concentrated in managed funds where we have no say in the underlying assets, and that's for obvious reasons. So it's accountable, it's transparent, but it also involves any personal involvement that can create conflicts of the kind that honourable members and the public would be concerned about. As far as 7-Eleven is concerned, it is a part of the Japanese index, and so any fund that has an investment in the Japanese index, as most big managed funds do, will have therefore a derived and very small investment. Now, the honourable members asked the question. Many of the honourable members opposite have superannuation in Australian super. Unless there has been a very recent change, they will find Australian super has an investment in 7-Eleven's holding company. I think I would also note that perhaps many honourable members opposite would be very familiar with, if not invested, in CBUS, which is the Construction and Building Union Superannuation Fund. It's backed by the CFMEU. Indeed, Caesar Mellon was a director of it until 2013. Now, according to CBUS's total private equity holdings as at 30 June last year, CBUS held investments in a number of distressed opportunities funds, the Sigurla Guff Distressed Opportunities Funds 3 and 2, and those funds are obviously ones which invest in distressed assets. The reality is that all of these big managed funds have a variety of assets, and the important thing is that they are
Member for Rankin will leave under 94A. He can't help himself.
And they're transparent, and I think honourable members should examine carefully the nature of their own investments and the funds they invest in before they engage on this sort of program of smearing.
The member for Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. My electorate of Wright has many vegetable growers who supply an immense amount of product both domestically and abroad. We have Moffat Farms at Arachula and Calfresh at Kelbar, which have a long history of exporting carrots and green beans to customers in New Zealand, Hong Kong, Singapore and the Middle East. We also have Give Brothers, who export to Asia, South Pacific and New Zealand. How will our government support businesses such as these to get their products to market quickly and more efficiently?
The Minister for Infrastructure and Transport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Wright for his question. He's been a very strong advocate of addressing future freight tasks in his electorate, to take advantage of free trade agreements and also to meet our growing infrastructure needs. And the member for Wright was born and raised in Queensland. He has a farming background. He worked in the agri-finance sector. But perhaps he knows the challenges more and the opportunities more that are faced by regional communities through his own investment in a general freight business, and the fact that he's actually employed people in those businesses, employed up to 100 people. So he's well aware of the challenges facing the freight sector, not just in his community, but right throughout Queensland and regional Australia. And the Turnbull-Joyce government is getting on with the job. We're getting on with the job of delivering a $50 billion infrastructure investment program, not just in our cities, not through major projects through the Minister for Urban Infrastructure, but also through projects in our regional highways, in our smaller country towns throughout rural and regional parts of Australia. And, Mr. Speaker, part of the challenge is dealing with the fact that Australia's freight task has quadrupled over the past 4 decades. In fact, between now and 2030, we expect to see a further growth in demand in freight in the order of 50%. So this increasing freight task demands more from the Australian infrastructure network, and all levels of government will be required to respond to it. That is why last week the Prime Minister, in response to the Australian Infrastructure Plan, announced that we would be undertaking a freight and supply chain strategy. We need to provide the right investment for the private sector to invest with confidence, but we need to also make sure we capitalise on those free trade agreements that the coalition government has been so successful in delivering for the Australian nation. So it was a key recommendation of Infrastructure Australia's report last week, and we're getting on with the job of doing that work over the next 12 months. Now, the freight study is important, Mr Speaker. It's important because we need to make sure we get the foundations right and make sure we deliver value for money for the Australian taxpayers and every investment we make in the infrastructure space. And the member for Wright also is a huge advocate and a strong supporter as well of the Melbourne-Brisbane Inland Rail project. Just like the members for Groom, the member for Maranoa, the member for Parkes, very keen supporters of the Inland Rail project. And I hear the member for Granville interjecting, and we are getting on with it. We are getting on with the member for Granville. There's $894 million being committed by the Turnbull-Joyce government to the Melbourne-Brisbane Inland Rail project. And we're getting on with it because we believe in the future of regional Australia, and we understand the importance of helping the Australian agricultural sector get its products to market. So we are getting on with the job. There's other major freight projects the government's investing in. We're investing in the Townsville Eastern Access Rail Corridor, the Moorebank Intermodal Terminal. There's $220 million for the Murray Basin Rail Project and $1.1 billion for the Toowoomba Second Range Crossing, all important freight projects. We understand, on this side of the House, the importance of planning, getting the job done right, getting value for money for the Australian taxpayers, and our national freight and supply chain strategy will be an important piece of work to guide those future investment decisions.
The Prime Minister.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
I thank the Prime Minister.